Okay, so welcome to Characters in Acts, our Bible study. This is week 2, and we're exploring the stories of Acts through some of the key characters.
Over the course of time that we've been doing these Bible studies online, I've raided various websites to find and adapt prayers, and there's a really good faith worship blogspot website that I've used quite often because it gives you prayers that are related to particular biblical passages. And the biblical passage that we are going to be looking at tonight is about being in community and making decisions and setting up for what comes into the future. So these are the characters. We've already looked at Peter last week. We'll be looking at Mary and the women who were with the group of followers of Jesus. And the particular, so that's the theme for today. Now, we're going to start like we do every week with a quick quiz. So Elizabeth will put you into breakout rooms. Just introduce yourself to people that are in the group if you don't know each other already. And these are the questions for you to cogitate upon. How many women are named as followers of Jesus? And can you name them? How many of these women are named in Luke's Gospel? And how many of these women are named in Acts? So this is women that were followers of Jesus in the lifetime of Jesus.
I'll just move
Okay,
on.
folks. So how many women are named as followers of Jesus? What am I bid?
I'll go 4.
4?
Four.
Well, probably more, but named, I suppose, is the thing, isn't it?
Yes, named is the thing.
Whether you include Mary, the mother of Jesus, as a follower.
Yes, that's a good question, Bill. Is Mary, the mother of Jesus, a follower of Jesus as well as being his mother? This is the number that I've got. Mary Magdalene.
Yeah.
Joanna, the wife of Chusa. Susanna. Salome. Mary of Bethany and Martha of Bethany because, Jesus goes to Mary and Martha's place, and we're assuming that they're the same Mary and Martha that are in John's Gospel who live in Bethany. Mary, the mother of James, and Mary, the wife of Clopas, as well as Mary, the mother of Jesus. So there are 9 women named. I'm not asking how many men are named because we know there's 12 plus. How many of these women are named in Luke's Gospel? Mary Magdalene is. Joanna and Susanna are. Mary and Martha are named, although not as being from Bethany. Mary, the mother of James, is named, and Mary, the mother of Jesus. And maybe Mary, who's associated with Clopas, could be who's in the story in Luke 24. But we have in Luke 24 just Cleopas and a companion. We don't even know whether the companion's male or female. So that's very uncertain. How many of these are named in Acts? What am I bid? None of those others, familiar to us from the gospel stories, appear in Acts except for Mary, the mother of Jesus, who's specifically identified in this scene that we're going to look at tonight. Okay, so that's our quiz for tonight. So the passage that we're looking at is the disciples, after the ascension of Jesus, when they saw him going up into heaven, return to Jerusalem, enter the city, go to the room upstairs where they were staying. The 11 men, disciples, are listed: Peter and John, James and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James, son of Alphaeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas, son of James. Judas Iscariot is not, of course, named. And then these were constantly devoting themselves to prayer together with certain women including Mary, the mother of Jesus, as well as his brothers. So here in this little scene, we have 11 men, certain women, including the mother of Jesus, Mary, and the brothers of Jesus, part of this little community formed in Jerusalem. So I want to look at each of those component parts. The 11 men, the main reason for this scene is that Peter says that they really need to appoint somebody to to replace Judas, who has met his end already, and that's narrated in the commentary that Luke gives on the speech of Peter in this scene. The 12th position is necessary because these 12 men, according to Luke's story, or according to Peter's speech in Luke's story, are the witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus. He says that in this speech. He says that again in chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost. He says it in chapter 3 when he's arrested for the first time by the Sanhedrin. He says it in chapter 5 when he's before the Sanhedrin for a second time. And he even says it in the speech that we ended up looking at last week in Caesarea, in the house of Cornelius. So the significance of these 12 men is that they are witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus. And in fact, that is also recognized by Paul in his speech in chapter 13 in Antioch of Pisidia. He says that they are now for many days he appeared to those who came up with him from Galilee to Jerusalem, and they are now his witnesses to the people. But of course, we know that, so the significance of 12 is most likely putting two and two together, putting the need to appoint the 12th person in Acts chapter 1 with what Jesus has said to the 12 already before he was arrested back in chapter 22 of Luke. You will sit on the thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So it's a nice, neat, schematic representation of the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 apostles of Jesus. And so it is handed down in church history, church tradition, and those 12 get to have great symbolic significance. We know, however, that there were more than 12 men who followed Jesus, because in order to replace Judas, they need to decide who's going to replace him. And there are two contenders for that position: Joseph, called Barsabbas, also known as Justus, and Matthias. And we don't know, were there more men? Were there more than just these 12 plus 13 plus 14? Were there more than these 14 men who were with Jesus throughout that time? It seems possible. So that's the men. Continuing on with the men, the brothers are just noted, the brothers of Jesus being present in this community in Jerusalem. The names of the brothers are given only once in all of the Gospels, and that's in chapter 6 at Mark, when Jesus is back in his hometown preaching in the synagogue, and there's an uprising and he's rejected. The names of his brothers are James and Joses and Judas and Simon, and that passage mentions his sisters as well. So the most likely presumption is that Joseph and Mary, in fact, had a number of children after Jesus. So all of these children are younger than Jesus. And that's the fact that they're mentioned in that scene would indicate that that's how Jesus was known, as the brother of these men and also these sisters. In Luke's Gospel, the only mention of the brothers of Jesus is in chapter 8, which is where the mother of Jesus and the brothers of Jesus are outside. There's a whole crowd inside listening to Jesus, and someone points out that they're outside, and Jesus kind of dismissively says, "Who are my brothers and my mother? They are the ones who do the will of God." It's like he's distancing himself from them. So those brothers, we don't know about the sisters, but the brothers at least are mentioned, as well as his mother, as being present in this scene in Jerusalem. Has there been a reconciliation at some point? So the first question, were there more than just a dozen or so men with him in that time in Galilee? The second question, were the family of Jesus at one point alienated from him, but later on reconciled to him? Third element in this scene is the women. Now, who are these women? There's a nice little Greek nuance here. The NRSV identifies the women as certain women, and certain women would imply, well, we should already know who they are. But when you go, as I did, looking for certain in the Greek text, it simply says, and women were with him. Not the women or not some women, but just women were with him. So certain is missing in the Greek. So there can be no certainty about who these allegedly certain women were. But we do have a sense of who some of these women might have been from those earlier references to the women in Luke's first volume. So although they're not named in Acts, maybe some of these women, maybe all of these women were part of that community that Luke's describing. At the end of the empty tomb scene in Luke's Gospel, he says that Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women who were with them went back and told what they had heard and seen to the apostles. So that's indicating that there was already a decent-sized group of women who saw the empty tomb and were given the message, Jesus is not here, he is risen. At the beginning of that story, on the first day of the week, early at dawn, they came to the tomb taking the spices that they had prepared and found the stone rolled away from the tomb. And the assumption is that that is the job of the women to do the anointing, and so that was the women that are obviously named later on. And they're the ones who get perplexed by the sudden appearance of two men in dazzling clothes. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground, but the men in dazzling clothes said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He's not here, he has risen." So there's a bunch of women in this very important scene, which comes towards the end of the Gospel of Luke. Even before that, there are two references where Jesus is on trial and crucified and buried, or actually not on trial. There's no witnesses directly to his trial. But when he's crucified, Luke says, following Mark, all his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. All his acquaintances, including the women who'd followed him from Galilee. And then some verses later on, the women who had came with him from Galilee followed. They saw the tomb. They saw how his body was laid. So the women are amongst the group that see him being crucified. And then the women go follow the soldiers taking the body to the tomb where he is laid, and they see him placed in the tomb. And that's obviously important so that they know where to come after the Sabbath is over to anoint the body. So these women were witnesses of the death and burial of Jesus. And so they actually have the same status as the men named in Acts, because they are the men were said to be witnesses to all that he's done up to his resurrection. The women are witnesses of key moments, and they had been with him in Galilee. And then the last thing to comment on is this very famous passage back in chapter 8 of Luke's Gospel. This is really early on in the time when Jesus' ministry started. Luke says that the 12 were with him, as well as some women who had been cured of evil spirits and infirmities. Let me pause on the some women, because here the NRSV has translated this as some women. But when I went to look at the Greek, actually the best translation of the Greek is certain women. So they put certain women in later on, and they've taken certain women out here. At any rate, some women who are known, and their names are given. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward Chusa, so someone fairly in a fairly significant position in the court. And Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of the resources. So we've got Mary, Joanna, and Susanna, the 3 who are named here. But even here, Luke says that there were many others. So we should get the impression that there were women with Jesus right throughout, or at many times throughout his ministry. So what, and the last thing to say about those women, which we'll pick up again next week, the role that these women perform is significant. The Greek word is diakonein. The NRSV translates it as they provided for them out of their resources. They were attending to the essential provisions which were necessary for Jesus and his travelling group to live on as they moved from place to place. Okay, so there's a lot of information there in that, just drawn out from this very short little passage. So what I want to do now, and if you have the resources, you will have these statements from the Gospel of Luke in front of you, but we're going to go into breakout rooms to discuss the statements that I'll put up on the screen before we buzz off into the rooms. Should we be imagining a group of men and women with Jesus when these statements are made, not just the 12? Are there women unidentified in the scenes that I've identified here? In fact, in almost every scene in Galilee and Samaria and right along the road to Jerusalem. So the fundamental question is, how might this change the way we read the Gospels from what is traditionally taught, I guess? So he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him, men and women, ? Then his disciples asked him what this parable meant. The male disciples, or all the disciples, or what? One day he got into a boat with his disciples across the lake. As they were going along the road, someone said to him, "I'll follow you wherever I go." Who are they? He sternly ordered and commanded them not to tell anyone. The Lord appointed 70 others and sent them on ahead of him in pairs. Elizabeth and I have already had our discussion about this as to whether there were women involved in that or not, but we'll leave that for you to canvass in your groups before we come back and explore that. In chapter 19, as they were listening to this, he went on to tell a parable because he was near to Jerusalem. And then in the Palm Sunday scene, as he was approaching the path down from the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of the disciples began to praise joyfully with a loud voice. So the question is, should we be imagining groups of men and women with Jesus in all of these scenes? In fact, in most of the scenes in the Gospel? And if so, how might this change the way we read the Gospels? There we go.
Okay, intrepid explorers of women and men in Acts. How did you go with these questions? Should we be imagining a group of men and women with Jesus and not just 12 men? We'll start there.
Yes. Yes.
Some emphatic yeses and nodding of heads. Anyone want to say
Wondering
why?
about society at the time, whether
in the synagogue, men and women were separated, and whether it was common for, in social situations, men and women to kind of end up with their own kind, I guess, for the men to end up on one side and women talking to the women, and
Like an Australian barbecue, really?
yes, basically.
But now, isn't it? Oh, it always
Yes.
is.
Probably in some ways. We know from like stories like Abraham in Genesis that the women had a separate part of the tent.
Yeah.
You know, when they were nomadic, to where Abraham's out talking to the male guests and Sarah's out the back in the tent. She's probably in the women's section doing that. And not so common, though sometimes Hellenistic men and women were separated. It would just depend on the forum they were in, like literally if they were in the forum and deciding voting, you'd only have men present because they were the only ones who could vote. But in some other ways, men and women would do things together, especially if you were a married couple. You could probably do certain things together. So mostly, I would say they did things separately, but there are occasions and places where they could come together. And depending on the size of the synagogue, you may or may not be able to segregate them.
Yeah,
It may just be women were up the back and men were down the front.
the evidence for segregation in synagogues is not strong.
No.
In this period, it's centuries later that starts to become clear, and we don't have a whole lot of textual data about synagogues in the first century. We do have increasingly archaeological data, and that's ambiguous. You can't, there isn't. When Elizabeth and I were in Durham, we went to Durham Cathedral, and there was this black line across the floor of the cathedral, and that's according to the story is that Cuthbert got that put there to say women could not cross over that line.
Cuthbert had a woman problem. He really did.
Of course, they were crossing over it today, but there's nothing like that in the archaeological evidence to say, here's the middle, men on this side, women on that side. It's
I wish I'd looked for that, but no.
Yes. The black line, yes.
It's probably been worn out from all the women scuffing at it, Sharon.
Yes. I think Joan had a good point or a good thought that when Jesus sent them out in pairs to visit the towns and, shake off the dust and that sort of thing, husband and wife, that makes some sense, but certainly would the women have been included in that sharing of the gospel?
John and I had this discussion. Husband and wife, yes, you could send out a pair that was a husband and wife. You certainly could not send out a male and a female that weren't related.
Or even two women. That would have been
just highly dangerous.
Two men is okay, but
if we've allowed the gospel writers a fair amount of license to frame and shape a story to suit their particular circumstance and what they're trying to say, why isn't it also open to us to use our imagination to shape a story that fits our understanding of the Jesus we want to see? So if we want to see a Jesus who's open and inclusive, why not use our imagination to tell the story just in a way that is consistent with our own theology and our understandings?
Understanding is, Bill, that 90% of the church probably does that anyway without thinking. And they cast Jesus in their own image and what they think. Like people who don't think women should be in ministry don't see that at all in the Bible, for example. So I think it happens. I think that whenever we're going to get imaginative, we ought to be grounded in something. There ought to be something that supports that. So we're not actually imagining something that's outrageously would not have happened. That's how I feel. I think it's wrong to say women would have gone out together on their own, unchaperoned. I just don't think that would have happened. For there are a whole lot of social and safety reasons. I just can't see Jesus sending women out into danger that way myself.
This is the writer who wrote Luke, and I do remember that in the triumphant entry, he gathered up in the writing of that all the whispers that were round, which to me says he got the women's voice, and I would extrapolate that into our Acts, that the women's voice was there and that Luke was listening to and wouldn't bother to say this was male or this was female.
I think that's right. I think the women's voice is definitely there in Luke. It's stronger in Luke than any other gospel, probably followed by John, but John has highly specific female characters doing specific things.
And therefore also in Acts.
Yeah. I think that's right. But I think if we imagine any Jesus we like if we want to say that he was an astronaut that flew off in a rocket ship, you can. But I'm not sure how much credibility it would have. I do think it needs to be anchored somewhere, and you extrapolate something that's plausible from that. That's just my feeling. Otherwise, we can float off anywhere. Any other comments that people would like to make?
We also thought that if all the New Testament books are written by blokes, so
they probably are,
which we thought they were, like it was uncommon, surely, to be able to write at that time. Is that right? So a lot of it would have been verbal storytelling.
Yes.
And then some of it got translated down onto the page. Ordered and fashioned down onto the page. I just thought it would be fascinating if there was a book actually written from the women's perspective. And it just might have been really interesting to have gotten that.
Here's what the science fiction community would call fanfic. That is, fans filling in the gap in narratives like Star Trek and Star Wars, where there's clearly missing bits. And there was fanfic, obviously, back in the first few centuries, because we've got the infancy narrative of Thomas, for example, that tells about the childhood of Jesus, trying to fill that in. And there is some fanfic written by women from women's point of view if you want to read it. I don't know about New Testament ones, but there's an excellent book called The Red Tent, which is about Jacob and Leah and Rachel and his wives. And that's written entirely. It's based on the Bible, but it's a novel. If you want to follow down that pathway, you'll probably find it's quite an interesting read. I can't remember the author, but it's called The Red Tent, so there can't be too many red tents around. So there are some people who've tried to answer that question, Matt, and write these stories to fill in these gaps. And you probably find things written by Lydia, for example, if you look hard enough.
It's Anita Diamond.
Oh, sorry. Were any of the Gnostics written by women or Gnostic books?
It's a good question, because Gnostics had women in some of their communities were more prominent, though they became more patriarchal over time, I think. You've got this Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and I'm not sure who wrote that, male or female, but it's certainly very pro-feminine and puts her as a sort of leading apostle, being picked on by Peter and the other blokes, I have to say, if you have a look at it. But it's probably a much later composition.
And there are, Matt, some scholars who would argue that some of the other Gnostic material has a female origin. The Great Thunder, there's been writing about whether that's actually female, and I think Pistis Sophia, another Gnostic work. So there's more of a possibility there because of the prominence of women in leadership and in ministry roles.
Yeah. So the Gnostics probably were a little bit less misogynistic than some of the others.
Yeah.
Here's hoping.
That's right. And of course, in Roman and Greek society, males voted and males made the decisions and they dominated. Wealthy women actually had reasonably equal status, but probably not so much with poorer women.
Yeah.
And wealthy
Yeah.
widows had it really good. And comparative, they paid the tax for being a widow, but they got the freedom.
So
Well,
Sharon
there is
has
that.
Sharon has put into the chat the details about The Red Tent by Anisha Diamond, 1997, Wyatt Books, for people to follow up. I'll include that in the quick quiz next week.
Yeah. Well, if you're into Old Testament fanfic that's done from a women's point of view, that's a good place to start. That
So-
particular book.
Let's push on.
Yep.
When Peter is talking to the group, it says we need to find someone else to replace Judas. Luke says together the crowd numbered about 120 persons. So that's a very solid basis for this movement. Now we need to start pinching salt along with this, because we need to remember that this is a story written probably 5 decades after the events it describes. Luke is not claiming that he was present at that meeting or an eyewitness. He does say at the beginning of the gospel that he's relying on information that is gleaned from people who were witnesses of various things, but it's not a direct account of the meeting. It's a stylized account that Luke is including to start his volume, probably writing 5 decades after the time it was written. Nevertheless, he's wanting to show that there was a decent basis for this movement, and of course it is men as well as women. Now, the one woman who is mentioned here by name is the mother of Jesus, Mary. So your next task in discussion in small groups, in the breakout rooms, is what else do we know about Mary? Where else is she mentioned, thinking particularly about Luke and Acts, and what is said about her? There's probably lots that could be said, but let's see, what do we get from your discussion about Mary? What do we know about Mary before this scene in Jerusalem?
How did you get on? What did you know or think you know about Mary, the mother of Jesus?
She'd been left in John's care and she pondered things in her heart. So I see her as a reflective person, a fairly quiet, unassuming person who would watch and meditate on what she sees and hears.
Well, Luke, obviously, it says at the what we know as the Annunciation that she pondered these things. Only in John do we have her at the cross with Jesus saying to her, "This is your son and this is your mother," to the beloved disciple. So that doesn't happen in Luke, and only the pondering does happen in Luke. So this quiet woman that Pat has claimed, who agrees with that? Who thinks she was very quiet and thoughtful and not saying much?
If she was quiet and thoughtful, she wouldn't have trumped up and said, "Where's Jesus? He's inside this house and he's going mad," or "We need to come and look after him." That's not a quiet woman. A pondering woman, yes. I thought that she was part of her community. She got everybody invited to the wedding at Cana and had enough social responsibility to say they'd run out of wine. She was the cousin of Elizabeth, not you personally, Elizabeth Rain, and was valid enough in her response when the Holy Spirit, "This is going to happen to you." And she said, "Well, okay." And Andy, a member of our congregation, has been to places in Israel that suggest that she was part of the community that wove the actual curtain that was split at the crucifixion. I have no background for that, but she
Because
was.
there is none, Sharon.
Yeah, that's what I thought of. I haven't voiced it loudly, but she was a woman well versed. I mean, if you look at the Magnificat, unless other words were given to her, she knew her Torah. Yeah.
Magnificat's a good point in question, probably. Do we really think these words are from a quiet, submissive woman?
No.
And if you say yes, you haven't read it, or you haven't read it properly, and you should go back and read it again because it's extremely seditious.
I haven't said she was submissive.
Just quietly spoken.
She wasn't quiet, Pat.
She
The
doesn't
Magnificat
come.
is not quiet. It's loud.
Yes. And she was a grandma. She would have been a grandma by that stage.
Yes, she would have been.
She might have been.
Her daughters, if they married at the same age as she had.
Yeah.
Mm.
So we have the Magnificat up there. Scattered the proud and the thoughts of their hearts, pulled down the powerful from their thrones. This is not a quiet woman. It's a very subversive woman. And I'm going to suggest you can't be subversive and quiet. You have to be loud if you're going to be subversive.
You could think sorry.
Determined.
Very determined.
Yes,
That's right.
And she would have had a part in teaching Jesus in his early years as well.
Now, that's a really interesting thing that you've just said there, because did Jesus get his seditious tendencies from his mother?
Maybe.
Well, they did grow up in a country under the dominion of Rome, and as somebody I've read once would have been in the house watching troops of soldiers marching by. And the other thing about Nazareth is they were the lookouts at the edge of Israel, looking out for the trouble coming, and hence we had a reputation for looking out for trouble, and nothing good will ever come from Nazareth, or can any good come from Nazareth.
They had a reputation for having trouble from Nazareth itself, let alone outside of Nazareth, in the sense there were zealots and there were people who rather chafed at the idea of being occupied by Rome. Not their favourite nation, shall we say.
No.
Any other comments that people want to make about Mary? And John has asked the question, is Mary present in the central teachings of Jesus? And we have Jesus' Magnificat, Mary's Magnificat and Jesus' Beatitudes there. Do they look like they are similar?
There's definitely points in common.
Yes.
Yeah, there are things in common, aren't they? Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Compared with filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty.
It made me think of how how kids repeat back to you the things you say to them.
Especially when you wish they wouldn't.
Yeah, especially.
That mum says.
That's right.
Yeah, so if, as children do, I'm sure Jesus would have internalized a lot of the things his mother always said, like, don't forget to take your hanky, or I don't know, I can't think, that's not an example. But.
So not only were there women travelling around and present hearing what Jesus was teaching and seeing what he was doing as he healed people and cast out demons, but his mother was, in a sense, there in so much of his adult ministry through the words that he was speaking, her influence, if not her physical presence.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is to think about, where does Mary get it from? Jesus signals when he goes to Nazareth and preaches in the synagogue. He's preaching on Isaiah 61. So a lot of what he does and says in his ministry picks up what Isaiah 61 says. But of course, Mary, in her, they're the questions. Mary, in her teaching, is reflecting Hebrew scripture as well. And in fact, the Magnificat itself really mirrors in various ways the song that Hannah sang centuries and centuries ago, that's recorded in 1 Samuel 2, I think. So in other words, Mary knew her scripture just like Jesus knew her scripture, which is an interesting kind of insight. Or at least Luke tells us that Mary knew his scripture, like Luke tells us that Jesus knew his scripture.
Well, certainly in the Gospel of Luke, I think we can say that Jesus' teachings reflected Mary's sentiments, at least as they're reflected in the Magnificat.
We have one final step to take tonight, and that is to ask what happened beyond that gathering of the 120 and where are women in that. And in fact, some of our later studies in this series will be looking at women who are significant, not that they were there in Jerusalem in this scene, but they do come to be significant in the ministries that happen beyond. The one clear place in Jerusalem that is interesting where a woman is mentioned is in chapter 12, after Peter is released from prison. He went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, where many had gathered and were praying. Now, this is another Mary. It's not Mary, the mother of Jesus, and it's not Mary Magdalene, and it's not Mary, mother of Clopas. It is Mary, mother of John, whose other name was Mark, John Mark, who in some traditions, traditionally is the author of Mark's Gospel. But at any rate, there's a house of Mary where many had gathered. So it's not an insubstantial small house. It's quite a decent-sized house. And it's her house. It's not in the name of any man. It's her house where the crowd could gather, the people could gather and pray. So this is a pointer to other scenes in Acts, and indeed other scenes in Paul's letters that show that women continued to be a part of the movement, that they provided hospitality and a space for gatherings of the people of the movement. And it points us to later scenes. So do we want to ask this question now, Elizabeth? Or did you?
Yes, we can ask this question now. Do you want to do this in the big group or?
Yeah.
I think in the big group at this time.
So where else? Yeah.
So where else in Acts do women play a significant role? I mean, we're going to meet some named women, but you might know them in advance.
Well, there's Lydia.
Lydia, yes, certainly. And we'll be looking at her in one of our sessions. Who else?
Timothy's mother and grandmother.
Sorry, one at a time. Pat?
Timothy's mother and grandmother.
Timothy's mother and grandmother, Julie?
Yes. Sorry. Priscilla?
Priscilla?
Priscilla and Aquila? Priscilla?
Not you, Siri. Go away.
And Dorcas?
Phoebe?
Who else?
Phoebe?
Dorcas?
Yeah. Dorcas, yes.
Huldah?
Who was that?
Huldah?
Huldah? I think she's wrong testament, aren't we?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Never mind.
She is a very significant woman, but not in the New Testament and not in Acts.
Yeah.
What about Tabitha?
Tabitha.
And Dorcas. Was that Lydia?
Same person.
Same person. Dorcas
exactly.
and Dorcas, Tabitha known as Dorcas or Dorcas known as Tabitha. I forget which way it's around. One's probably Aramaic and one is Greek, I think, for her names. But the meaning is the same.
There's a woman of the Herod's household? Is it Judith or Julia or something like that?
Julia.
In the Gospel, it mentions someone who's the wife of one of Herod's stewards.
Mm.
Is that Clopas'
Yeah,
wife? I don't know she's in
Yeah,
Acts, is she,
no.
Joanna,
John?
the wife of Susan.
Oh, Joanna. Right.
And Junia.
Junior is
yes. Junior, who actually had scribes make
Well,
her a man.
But where is Junior and Phoebe
Where
mentioned?
is Junior? Yes, where is she? She is important in the New Testament. Where does she live?
In the Bible.
She does live in the Bible and she does live in the New Testament. There's a big hint on your screen at the moment.
Romans.
Where do we find Junior?
Romans.
Oh, there we go. Look at that.
Romans 16. Romans 16 is just littered with women doing all
Yes.
sorts of things. As you can see, we have Phoebe lives there. Prisca and Priscilla, Priscilla and Aquila. Priscilla is mentioned 4 times in 4 separate books of the New Testament, which is really, really unusual. So
And
clearly she was very prominent.
And told off some of the disciples that they weren't quite getting it right, and was a teacher.
Her name is always put before her husband's, I think, or mostly.
Mostly
Mm.
it is, yeah.
Mostly. So we have another Mary. Mary, a very common name. We have Junior. Then
Hermas.
who else? Rufus and his mother,
And Olympus.
Olympus. Yes, Nereus and his sister. Then Olympus and a Julia. So we can see brothers and sisters who are with that somebody, Hermas and the brothers and sisters who are with them. So that's probably a church. So you can see from Romans 16 that there's lots and lots of women, probably in leadership roles in the New Testament. And Luke agrees with Paul and and follows up some of these named women here and what they were doing. So Romans 16 is actually quite important.
Isn't it? I hadn't realised it was.
I mean, it just looks like a bunch of greetings, and you might look at it briefly and think, why is this important? It's just all these greetings to people. It's important because of who is named and their gender.
And I gather, Elizabeth, that you've underlined, John, you've underlined the female names, have you?
No, the females are in bold.
Right.
The men are underlined by comparison.
Right. And the family of Narcissus, is that definitely a male name?
Yes.
Narcissus is a male name, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Narcissus is the subject of one of the Greek myths and legends.
Yes.
He was a very vain young man, and he was punished by the gods by falling in love with himself. Our word narcissistic comes from it. And eventually he was so enamored of his reflection near a pond he wouldn't move, so they turned him into a flower.
And we grow them alongside the dandelions. Daffodils.
Yes, they are a common garden flower, narcissus. So, yes. So, yes, it is definitely you can tell by the endings if it's male or female, usually, because Greek's an inflected language and males and female names, like in Hebrew, tend to have different endings.
So Hermes is male and Hermas is female, for instance, in verse 14.
And you can see US is a common ending as well as ES for men.
So which one of these carried the letter to the church in Rome?
Oh, who knows?
One of them.
Chloe.
Okay.
Chloe.
The theory is that it was Chloe, Greek Chloe's people.
And therefore read it and taught them about what it meant.
Yeah.
Some women were literate, probably well-off women. You could probably assume that most merchant women like Lydia were probably literate because they had to deal with accounts and things like that. But literacy was, if 15% of the population was literate in the first century, that would have been a goodly number. It may have been less than that. And of that 15%, probably only 2 to 3% of women would be literate. But there certainly were some literate women. tend to be more well-to-do than poor women.
Mm-hmm.
So if you go to the end of this, what's on the screen, just before greet one another with a holy kiss, the words from Paul that we had to completely reinterpret and reimagine during the pandemic and its aftermath.
Yes.
Before that, greet all the saints who are with them. Now, once again, in Paul's letters, when we have this reference to the saints, Paul writes to the saints in such and such a place or so-and-so, another church. We need to ask the question, is he writing just to the men or is he writing to men and women? Because this chapter clearly shows that there's almost as many women as there are men in his mind in the church in Rome. So, again, a broadening of how we understand scriptural passages.
Romans 16 is always good to have in your back pocket when being met with a complementarian. And you can remind them of it. And Junia, of course, so outraged some of the patriarchal men that they changed her to Junius, which is the male ending, which is actually no such name. There is no male Junius known anywhere in any of the literature, so their efforts were in vain.
They did that, but they didn't do it to other significant women. I wonder why poor old
Junia
copped it.
She was named as an apostle, that's why. And we can't have that, Bill, can we? Shock and horror. We can have them teaching like Priscilla. We can tolerate that as long as she's with Aquila or her husband. But we can't have them being apostles. That's just women getting way too ahead of themselves.
It could be like Phoebe, a deacon.
Yes. Yeah. We can tolerate that as long as the deacon is subordinate to the male, like in deacons in the Sydney diocese. But we cannot have an apostle. That is just out of the question. So, yes, that's why they changed her, because she was designated as being great among the apostles. Any other questions or comments people would like to make before we finish up? And John thrills you with what's happening next week?
I just was thinking that in Christianity, Jesus is portrayed as a mild and meek person. You know that prayer for little children? Gentle Jesus, meek and mild. You know, and then you think about what you read, and you would think in Christianity they really wanted him to be a meek and mild personality, instead of he really had a temper on occasions, and he stood up for what he believed in, and he was a leader. There was nothing meek and mild about him. So why would one think that his mother may have been meek and mild?
If the Magnificat is anything to go by, she certainly wasn't.
Oh, yes.
And
that's right.
And
so Christianity's
in the church, and you would have had a bit of courage to be in the Church of Jerusalem, given persecution and other problems that happened among the Jewish community with defecting members to Christianity. So, yeah, I mean, gentle Jesus, meek and mild, I don't know. Did he gently whip people with his cord, you know, when he was raging around the temple? I don't know. It doesn't make a lot of sense.
I think the gentle Jesus is a thing of the church, though, isn't it? It's not of the Bible.
Yes. Yeah. No, it's not the Bible.
The church and the Roman church is wanted a doe-eyed, meek and mild Mary.
Yes. All the sort of Catholic pictures you see of Mary or the statues, she's veiled in blue. She's often wearing white and blue. She's often in prayer. She's either looking up like this to heaven or her eyes are cast down. And she is cast as meek, mild and submissive. And I would put to you that she was none of those things.
Like the Italian Jesus, he's the art.
Yes.
Very doe-eyed as well.
Well, he can be. And of course, he's white.
Very white.
Which the actual Jesus is highly unlikely to have been white, and neither was his mother.
No blue eyes, no blonde hair.
Well, no.
No.
And his feet never got dirty either.
Well, he didn't have to have them washed, so yeah, sure.
Okay, folks. Next week we're moving on to chapters 6 and 7 of Acts, so you're welcome to read those in advance of the session. We'll be focusing on Stephen, who was the first martyr. Bring your stones. He was the first deacon. Bring your table serving
implements.
And Stephen is also the man who delivered the longest of all the speeches in Acts. It wasn't Peter, it wasn't Paul, it was Stephen. So that's his fascination for me from the study that I did years ago with the speeches in Acts. So next week is Stephen, Acts chapter 6 and 7. And we'll start with a quick quiz and then look at various components of the story of Stephen from the book of Acts.